Prehistoric Earth was not a forgiving place. Predators with jaws powerful enough to crush bone ruled the land. And survival wasn't just difficult. It was a daily war against creatures that make today's deadliest animals look like house pets. Now, if someone offered you a one-way ticket back to prehistoric times, would you take it? No hospitals and weapons that could stop a charging Tyrannosaurus. Just you, your wits, and an environment designed to kill you in 100 different ways. Yeah, I didn't think so. But here's what makes the ancient world truly mind-blowing. The creatures that lived back then didn't just survive this nightmare, they thrived in it. Dinosaurs, mosasaurs, woolly mammoths, saber-toothed cats. These weren't just large animals, they were titans. Their sizes, feats, and durability, all legendary. We've all seen the documentaries showing these creatures in their prime, hunting, fighting, dominating their world. But sometimes, it takes a truly unique fossil to remind us of just how metal they really were. And I'm not talking about fossils showing animals locked in eternal battle, like the famous fighting dinosaurs. Those are intense, no doubt. But what actually demonstrates the true grit of prehistoric life are the specimens who bear the scars of gruesome wounds, devastating diseases, and catastrophic injuries, and yet somehow manage to carry on, in some cases, making full recoveries that would put modern medicine to shame. Because prehistoric animals were so wild, there's no shortage of wild examples to choose from. But a pretty good place to start is with an animal that quite literally had its face snatched. And I don't mean snatched like slang. I mean its face was actually taken. So what exactly was this faceless survivor? A prognathodon. Now, you might not have heard of this animal before, but trust me, it was an absolute nightmare of the ancient seas. Prognathodon belonged to the mosasaur family, those massive marine reptiles that dominated the oceans during the late Cretaceous. And among mosasaurs, this thing was one of the biggest and baddest to ever exist. Prognathodon ate everything: fish, squid, turtles. One specimen was found with gut contents showing all three. Prognathodon was a top predator that found success across North America, Africa, Europe, and Australia. Basically, if it lived in the ocean during the late Cretaceous, it was on the menu. Oh, and it gets worse. That included other mosasaurs. These animals were known cannibals. When food got scarce or territories overlapped, they had no problem turning on their own kind. Which brings us to specimen NHMM 2012-072, discovered in the Netherlands near Maastricht. When researchers first examined this fossil, something was immediately obvious. Its face was essentially missing, not damaged, missing. Huge chunks of its upper jaw, cortical bone, and parts of its premaxilla had all been violently stripped away by something with terrifying power. And given the size of this victim, there's really only one suspect: another mosasaur, probably another prognathodon. This wasn't some freak accident or run-in with a rock. This was a brutal, deliberate attack. One massive predator clamping down on another's face with enough force to rip away bone and flesh in a single catastrophic bite. Now think about that for a second. A massive chunk of your face is just gone. You're alone in an ancient ocean with nothing but open water and predators around you, no way to stop the bleeding, and with flippers instead of limbs, you can't even shield the damage. Any other animal? That's a wrap. Story over. But for this prognathodon, just another Tuesday. Because despite having a gaping hole where its face should have been, this specimen shows clear signs of healing. The surrounding tissue and actual bone had begun to repair themselves. This animal didn't just survive the attack, it kept living for a long time afterward, possibly over a year. Now, that doesn't mean recovery was pretty. The healing process would have been absolutely excruciating. Blood loss, exposed nerve endings, massive tissue trauma. The inflammation got so intense that it actually cut off blood flow to certain areas, causing parts of its face to become dead tissue. And as if that wasn't enough, bacteria eventually seeped into the wound and infection set in. In the end, it wasn't the injury itself that killed this prognathodon. It was the infection. The bacteria spread to a point where the animal could no longer operate what was left of its jaws, and it slowly starved. But let's be clear here. This creature survived a face-snatching attack for over a year before infection finally took it down. The wound itself? It was handling that just fine. Absolute legend. But not every catastrophic injury ends this way. Some animals don't just survive, they make near-complete recoveries and live to old age. And perhaps no creature demonstrates this level of durability better than the king of prehistory itself. Tyrannosaurus rex. You know the reputation. 40 feet of muscled teeth and pure predatory terror. But here's what the documentaries don't always show you. Being the king of the Cretaceous meant taking an absolutely savage beating on a regular basis. And no two specimens prove this better than Stan and Sue. Let's start with Stan. Dug up in South Dakota and assembled bone by bone, this rex quickly became one of the most studied dinosaurs in history. And when researchers started cataloging his skeleton, the list of injuries just kept growing. And growing. By the end, they'd counted 19 separate pathologies. 19 on one animal. His skull alone tells a horror story. Deep puncture wounds, the kind that only come from another Tyrannosaurus, had pierced through the bone in multiple places. One bite to the back of his head was so vicious it actually punched through to his brain case. Let me say that again. Something bit Stan in the skull hard enough to reach his brain cavity. For most creatures, that's instant death. For Stan, apparently just a really bad headache because the wound healed over completely. But it gets worse. A third bite, this one at the base of his skull, shows evidence of having actually broken his neck. Now, I probably don't need to explain that a broken neck is generally fatal. Like, extremely fatal. But Stan's body looked at that diagnosis and said, "Nah, we're not done yet." The healing caused excess bone growth and left him with what must have been chronic stiffness and pain for the rest of his days. But he lived. He kept hunting. And we're still not done with Stan's medical file. Bite marks on his cheeks and jaw, multiple fractured ribs from blunt force trauma, and those tiny circular holes dotting his facial bones. Parasites. Bone-eating parasites that had apparently set up permanent residence in his skull. So on top of everything else, Stan was walking around with little organisms literally consuming his face from the inside. All of this, the skull punctures, and Stan still made it to around 24 years old before he finally died. And not from his injuries either, just old age catching up with him. But Stan wasn't even the toughest Rex on record. That honor goes to Sue, the biggest, most complete T-Rex skeleton ever discovered. Her right shoulder blade was badly damaged with a significant chunk of bone torn away. This likely made using that arm a painful nightmare if she could use it properly at all. The same limb also showed signs of a torn tendon at some point. Scientists think this damage came from a struggle with prey. And keep in mind, Sue's prey were massive animals themselves. Taking down a multi-ton hadrosaur isn't exactly a gentle process. And during one of those battles, Sue picked up not 2, but 3 broken ribs. 3. In typical Rex fashion, though, she survived well past the incident. The bones show clear signs of healing. Sue just powered through it like it was nothing. Then came the health problems. Her left fibula was grotesquely enlarged from infection. Her tail vertebrae had fused, likely from arthritis caused by repeated trauma over the years. Signs of gout, yeah, the same condition that affects humans, showed up in her bones too. This dinosaur was basically falling apart from the inside while still ruling her territory. And for the final cherry on top, those mysterious holes in her skull that researchers initially blamed on bacterial infection or combat. Turns out it was parasites, a nasty infestation that burrowed into her jaw and slowly ate away at the bone. Every time Sue opened her mouth to feed, she was doing it with organisms actively feasting on her skull. Nightmare fuel. With all of this damage, you'd think Sue would have died young, but she didn't. She reached full maturity, grew to over 40 feet long, weighed up to 14 tons, and lived to approximately 33 years old. That makes her the longest-lived T-Rex specimen ever found. 33 years of absolute dominance while her body was basically a walking injury report. Stan and Sue weren't just dinosaurs, they were tanks wrapped in scales. Living proof that Tyrannosaurus rex didn't just earn its crown through size and power, it earned it through an almost supernatural ability to absorb punishment and keep going. But survival against impossible odds isn't limited to giant reptiles. Millions of years later, our own ancestors would show this same unbreakable spirit. And one Neanderthal, buried deep in an Iraqi cave, would become the single most injured hominin ever discovered. We've talked about creatures designed by millions of years of evolution to take damage and keep moving. But now we're getting personal, because this next survivor wasn't some distant reptile from a world we can barely imagine. This was one of us. Well, almost. A Neanderthal. And not just any Neanderthal, the single most battered, broken, and damaged hominin ever pulled from the earth. His name, or at least the name scientists gave him, was Shanidar 1. Found in Shanidar Cave in the Zagros Mountains of Iraq during excavations in the late 1950s, this skeleton immediately stood out. Not because it was well preserved, but because almost every part of it showed signs of catastrophic injury. The guy running the dig, anthropologist Ralph Selecki, knew right away they'd found something special. He nicknamed the specimen Nandy, and once you hear what Nandy went through, you'll understand why that name stuck. Let's start at the top. Nandy's skull showed evidence of a major crushing blow to the left side of his head. We're not talking about a minor bump here. This was serious blunt force trauma, the kind that caves in bone. The impact was so severe that it likely caused permanent damage to his brain. The left side of his face was visibly deformed from the healed injury. And the consequences? He was almost certainly blind in his left eye and deaf in his left ear. One hit to the head, and 2 of his senses were gone forever. But we're just getting started. Move down to his right arm, and things get even worse. His right shoulder blade was severely underdeveloped. His collarbone had been fractured at some point, and his right arm? It wasn't just injured, it was gone. The humerus, that's the upper arm bone, shows clear signs of an amputation just above the elbow. Whether this happened through a traumatic accident or deliberate removal by his community, we don't know for certain. But the bone had healed over, meaning Nandy survived the loss and lived for years afterward with only one functional arm. And there's more, because of course there's more. His right foot and lower leg showed signs of a fracture that had healed improperly, leaving him with a permanent limp. Arthritis had set into multiple joints, causing chronic pain with every movement. The wear patterns on his teeth suggest he was using his mouth as a tool to compensate for his missing arm, gripping and tearing things because he only had one hand to work with. So living roughly 45,000 years ago in a harsh mountain environment where survival meant hunting large animals, gathering food, avoiding predators, and enduring brutal winters. For a fully healthy Neanderthal, this was already difficult. For Nandy, it should have been impossible. And yet this man lived to be somewhere between 40 and 50 years old. In an era where most Neanderthals died young from sheer difficulty of existence, Nandy made it to what we'd consider middle age today, with half his senses gone and one arm missing. Let that sink in for a moment. Now here's where the story shifts from brutal to genuinely moving. Nandy couldn't have survived alone. There's simply no way. The only explanation, the only possible explanation, is that his community took care of him. They fed him, protected him, kept him alive for decades, despite the massive burden his disabilities would have placed on the group. Think about what that means. These weren't mindless brutes like old stereotypes suggested. Neanderthals had compassion. They had social bonds strong enough to support their weakest members for years on end. Shanidar 1 isn't just evidence of physical survival. It's evidence of love, of community, of the kind of care we like to think makes us uniquely human. Turns out, our closest relatives had it too. Nandy's skeleton sits in a museum now, just bones in a display case. But those bones tell one of the most powerful stories in all of paleontology. But humans weren't the only ones showing signs that survival sometimes required help. Millions of years earlier, in a world ruled by claws and teeth, even apex predators occasionally found themselves broken, injured, and dependent on others. And nowhere is that more unsettling than in one of the most feared hunters of the Ice Age, Smilodon fatalis. But being a top predator means nothing if you can't actually hunt. And for one Smilodon discovered in the La Brea tar pits of Los Angeles, hunting should have been completely off the table from day one. The specimen is cataloged as LACMHC131, and when researchers examined its hip bones, they found something that made them do a double take. This cat had severe hip dysplasia. Now, if you're not familiar with hip dysplasia, here's the short version. It's a deformity where the ball of the thigh bone doesn't sit properly in the hip socket, causing instability and pain with every step. For a house cat with hip dysplasia, life can still be manageable. A little discomfort, maybe some medication, a warm bed to sleep in. But for a wild Smilodon, this is basically a death sentence written at birth. These animals survived by launching explosive ambush attacks on prey that could weigh over 1,000 pounds. A saber-toothed cat that can't run properly, can't put full power through its hind legs, that cat doesn't eat. And yet, LACMHC131 made it to full adulthood. The level of chronic pain this animal must have experienced is hard to even imagine. But while Smilodon needed help from others to overcome its disability, our next survivor faced its nightmare completely alone. A duck-billed dinosaur that took one of the most terrifying injuries imaginable, a direct hit from a Tyrannosaurus rex, and somehow walked away to tell the tale. Well, fossilize the tale anyway. All right, let's set the scene. You're an Edmontosaurus, a large plant-eating duck-billed dinosaur living in North America about 66 million years ago. Life is pretty straightforward. You spend your days munching on vegetation, traveling with your herd, trying not to get noticed by anything with sharp teeth. And then one day, out of nowhere, the most powerful predator on the continent decides you look like lunch. A Tyrannosaurus rex. And it's coming straight for you. Most prey animals in this situation have two options: run faster than you've ever run before, or accept that you're about to become dinner. But for one particular Edmontosaurus, there was apparently a third option: take the hit and keep going. We know this because of a fossil discovered with something absolutely wild preserved in the skull: bite marks. Deep, unmistakable gouges carved into the bone of the head, specifically the crest region above the brain. The size and spacing of these marks match up perfectly with Tyrannosaurus teeth. This wasn't speculation or guesswork. A T-Rex had literally chomped down on this Edmontosaurus's head. Direct hit, no question about it. Now, here's where it gets insane. The bone around those bite marks shows clear evidence of healing. How is that even possible? We're talking about jaws that could pulverize bone, attached to a predator that weighed 8 or 9 tons. One good bite should have been the end of the story. Skull crushed, brain destroyed, game over. But somehow, this particular bite didn't land with full force. Whatever happened, the bite connected, but not lethally. Don't get it twisted though, this wasn't a minor scratch. Those tooth marks went deep into the bone. The Edmontosaurus would have been bleeding heavily, probably in shock, definitely in tremendous pain. The wound would have been open to infection in an environment with no antibiotics and plenty of bacteria. Everything about this situation should have killed this dinosaur within days, if not hours. But it didn't die. Somehow this hadrosaur's immune system fought off infection, and somehow this animal rejoined its herd and continued living its life. Now, with a permanent reminder of the day it looked death in the face and said, "Not today." Speaking of taking damage and refusing to quit, our next specimen might hold the record for the most beat-up individual dinosaur ever discovered. And his list of injuries? It reads less like a medical report and more like a catalog of everything that can possibly go wrong with a body. If there was an award for the most injured dinosaur ever discovered, Big Al would win it in a landslide. Allosaurus is the kind of animal you'd expect to dish out punishment, not receive it. But Big Al? This poor guy was on the receiving end more often than not. Let's start with the ribs. Multiple fractures. At least 5 ribs showed signs of breaks that had healed over time. Then there's the tail. Several vertebrae in Big Al's tail showed damage and abnormal bone growth, suggesting injuries that had partially healed but left permanent deformities. His right hand had issues too. One of the fingers showed signs of infection that had eaten into the bone. And his shoulder? Damaged. The scapula had evidence of trauma that would have made using that arm a constant struggle. But the worst damage was in his feet. And for a bipedal predator that relied on running down prey, Foot injuries are about as bad as it gets. Big Al had problems in both feet. Bones showed signs of infection, abnormal growths, and what appears to be a severe case of osteomyelitis, a deep bone infection that causes excruciating pain and can spread if left untreated. Which, in the Jurassic, it always was. His right foot in particular was a disaster. The second toe, one of the main weight-bearing digits, was severely infected. The bone was deformed, eaten away in places, and showed signs of chronic inflammation. And yet, despite all of this, Big Al was still a young adult when he died, probably only around 8 years old, which means he'd been accumulating these injuries throughout his short life, and somehow kept going. So what finally took Big Al down? Researchers believe it was that infected foot. A predator that can't run is a predator that can't eat. And here's the wild part. Big Al isn't even unique among Allosaurus specimens. Another skeleton, nicknamed Big Al II, was discovered later with its own impressive collection of pathologies. Different injuries, same story. These predators lived hard, violent lives where damage was basically guaranteed. Big Al just happens to be the most complete example of what that lifestyle looked like written in bone. When you look at Big Al's skeleton today, you're not just seeing a dinosaur, you're seeing a survivor, an animal that refused to quit despite everything his world threw at him. 19 separate injuries. That's not just toughness, that's something close to heroic. But if Big Al's story seems extreme, wait until you hear about our next specimen, a creature from even further back in time, the Triassic period, that somehow survived with damage to all 4 of its limbs. Meet the most pathological reptile of the Triassic, a phytosaur named Smilosicus. We've gone from the Cretaceous to the Jurassic. Now let's travel even further back to the Triassic period, over 200 million years ago. This was a different world entirely. Dinosaurs were just getting started, still small and insignificant. One of the largest phytosaurs was Smilosicus, the kind of predator you'd assume lived a relatively comfortable life at the top. And then researchers found a specimen that completely shattered that assumption. This particular Smilosicus, discovered in what is now Arizona, holds a very unusual record. It's the most pathological Triassic animal ever found. When scientists examined the skeleton, they discovered damage everywhere they looked. And not just minor stuff. We're talking serious, debilitating injuries that affected the animal's ability to function on a basic level. Most shocking of all, every single one of its 4 limbs showed signs of significant trauma. Wrap your head around that. All 4 limbs damaged. For any animal, losing the use of one limb is a major problem. Losing 2 is potentially fatal. But all 4? That's not just an injury. That's a complete system failure. The damage included fractures, infections. So how does a 39-foot predator survive with 4 busted limbs? The answer probably lies in its lifestyle. Phytosaurs were semi-aquatic. They spent most of their time in water, where buoyancy would have taken a lot of pressure off those damaged legs. On land, this Smilosicus would have been practically helpless. But in the water, it could still float. There's something almost inspiring about that. An animal dealt one of the worst hands possible. Figured out how to survive anyway. Just adapted and endured until its body finally gave out. If that's not the definition of resilience, I don't know what is. And that brings us to the end of our journey through prehistoric survival. These animals weren't just tough, they were something else entirely. If you enjoyed this journey through prehistoric survival, smash that subscribe button and share this with someone who loves dinosaurs. Drop a comment, which survivor shocked you the most?